If this sounds like a joke, it's not. Imagine marching into a battle you never agreed to fight, against people who also didn't mean to fight you, all because everyone involved kept nodding politely while understanding absolutely nothing. No grand ideological clash, no master strategy, no dramatic last stand. Just a lot of uniforms, a lot of weapons, and a catastrophic amount of, yeah, sure, that sounds right, spoken in completely different languages. This is the story of a battle that didn't start with hatred, ambition, or revenge. It started with confusion. The kind of confusion that happens when empires get too big, armies get too mixed, and nobody thinks to ask the obvious question. Hey, does anyone here actually speak the same language? And yes, this really happened. Picture a tense military camp at night. Soldiers from different corners of an empire, each with their own accents, customs, and completely incompatible vocabularies. Everyone is on edge. Everyone is tired. And everyone assumes that the people next to them know what's going on. They don't. Somewhere in the darkness, a simple misunderstanding sparks a chain reaction so ridiculous that historians still struggle to explain it without sounding like they're describing a sketch comedy gone wrong. Orders are misheard. Warnings are misinterpreted. Commands turn into threats. And before anyone can clarify what they meant, things spiral. Fast. By sunrise, officers are staring at the aftermath, wondering how an organized army managed to fight itself, panic itself, and collapse itself, without the enemy even doing much of anything. It's the kind of historical moment that makes you realize something uncomfortable. Sometimes the greatest threat to a military force isn't strategy, weather, or even the enemy. Sometimes it's a language barrier and a whole lot of confidence. This episode isn't about mocking soldiers or cultures. It's about exploring one of history's most surreal reminders that human systems, no matter how powerful, are only as smart as their communication. And when that breaks down, even the most disciplined army can turn into a very expensive group chat where everyone misunderstood the message. So settle in, because this isn't just a battle story. It's a masterclass in how not to coordinate thousands of armed people who don't share a common language and somehow expect everything to work out fine. Spoiler, it didn't. To understand how an entire battle could explode out of pure misunderstanding, we need to step back and look at the kind of military machine involved here. This wasn't a small, tight-knit force where everyone trained together, spoke the same language, and shared the same background. This was an empire-sized army, the kind that collected territories the way some people collect souvenirs, and then expected all of them to march in the same direction. The army was a mosaic. Germans, Italians, Hungarians, Croats, Romanians, and several other groups, all wearing variations of the same uniform, all sworn to the same emperor, and all absolutely convinced that everyone else knew what they were doing. On paper, it looked impressive. In reality, it was like assembling a football team where nobody agreed on the rules or the language of the referee. Commanders issued orders in one language. Those orders were translated, simplified, misunderstood, retranslated, and sometimes just guessed at. Soldiers often relied on gestures, tone of voice, and vibes. And when you're holding a musket at night, vibes are not a reliable communication system. This army was operating in a tense environment, facing an external enemy that everyone expected to encounter at any moment. Morale was shaky. Supplies were inconsistent. Sleep was optional. Paranoia, however, was plentiful. And that's the dangerous cocktail right there. When people are tired, scared, and surrounded by strangers they can't properly talk to, they start filling in the gaps themselves. A shouted word becomes a threat. A movement becomes an attack. A warning becomes an order. Add darkness, alcohol, and the constant expectation that the enemy could be anywhere. And suddenly even your allies start looking suspicious. What makes this situation especially fragile is that many of these soldiers had never fought alongside each other before. They didn't recognize each other's commands, accents, or even basic military phrases. What sounded like a harmless word in one language could sound aggressive or downright hostile in another. There was also a strong assumption at the top that discipline alone would solve these issues. The idea was simple. Everyone wears the same uniform, follows the same emperor, and obeys orders. Therefore, everyone will magically function as one unit. History, of course, had other plans. Because when tension replaces clarity and authority replaces understanding, The smallest spark can light an absurdly large fire. All it takes is one moment where someone thinks they heard the wrong thing and reacts accordingly. By the time this army settled into its camp, waiting for what they believed would be a confrontation with the enemy, the real danger was already among them. Not hidden in the forest, not advancing across the hills. It was standing right next to them, holding the same weapon and speaking a language they didn't understand. And that's when the plan, if you can even call it that, started to unravel. The plan, if we're being generous enough to use that word, was painfully simple. Set up camp. Stay alert. Don't panic. And wait for the enemy to show up. On paper, it was fine. Almost responsible. In reality, it assumed something wildly optimistic. That thousands of exhausted, multilingual soldiers would calmly sit around a dark campsite, fully synchronized, and respond rationally to any unexpected situation. That assumption did not age well. As night fell, discipline began to soften. Guards rotated. Small groups chatted in their own languages. Tension lingered in the air like humidity before a storm. Everyone knew the enemy was somewhere nearby. No one knew exactly where. And everyone expected someone else to notice them first. Then came one of history's most underappreciated catalysts of chaos: alcohol. Some soldiers, reportedly cavalry units, managed to get their hands on local spirits. Nothing organized, nothing official, just enough to turn an already fragile situation into a social experiment no one had signed up for. Laughter grew louder. Voices carried further into the night. And that thin line between relaxed and reckless quietly disappeared. At some point, another group of soldiers wandered over. They wanted to share. The problem wasn't the request itself, it was the delivery. The words didn't line up. The tone didn't translate. What was meant as a casual demand came across as aggressive. What was meant as refusal sounded like defiance. Voices rose. Gestures became sharper. Someone shoved someone else. And in a multilingual army, a shove doesn't need much explanation. Suddenly, someone shouted a warning. Or maybe an insult. Or maybe a joke. No one agrees, because no one understood it the same way. But one thing is clear. The word that echoed through the camp sounded a lot like a call to arms. And once that idea entered the collective imagination, it spread faster than any actual information ever could. Soldiers who hadn't seen anything started reacting to what they thought they heard. Weapons were grabbed. Commands were shouted, each in different languages, each adding another layer of confusion. Some troops believed they were under attack. Others believed they were being ordered to move. A few thought they were stopping a riot. No one thought, maybe we should clarify this. Because at night, under stress, with weapons in hand, clarity is usually the first casualty. The irony is almost impressive. The army had spent weeks preparing to face an external threat, yet never prepared for the possibility that it might miscommunicate with itself. No shared emergency phrases. No unified command language at the tactical level. Just an unspoken belief that everything would somehow sort itself out. Instead, the plan quietly mutated into something else entirely. Not a defensive maneuver. Not a strategic repositioning. A full-scale misunderstanding waiting to detonate. And in the next few moments, it absolutely would. What happened next unfolded less like a battle and more like a prank played by history itself. Except nobody was laughing, and everyone was armed. A single shot rang out. To this day, no one can say with confidence who fired it or why. Maybe someone panicked. Maybe someone thought they saw movement. Maybe someone just made the worst possible decision at the worst possible moment. The reason almost doesn't matter, because once that sound cut through the night, the situation crossed a line it could never uncross. In an army already primed for fear, a gunshot doesn't ask questions. It delivers answers, wrong ones. Shouts erupted across the camp. Warnings, commands, accusations, all flying at once in a dozen different languages. To some ears, it sounded like the enemy is attacking. To others, it sounded like advance. To a few unlucky souls, it sounded like they're already here. Units began forming up against shapes they couldn't identify. And when you can't communicate clearly, every silhouette becomes suspicious. Someone yelled something that sounded like an order. Someone else tried to countermand it. Another group, hearing neither correctly, assumed betrayal. Muskets were raised. Shots followed, not aimed with strategy or intent, but fired in the general direction of not us. Unfortunately, in that camp, not us was a very flexible concept. Officers tried to intervene, shouting commands meant to restore order. But authority only works when it's understood. A command in German meant nothing to a soldier who spoke Italian. A warning in Hungarian sounded like an attack to someone from somewhere else entirely. Instead of calming the chaos, every shouted order added fuel to it. The darkness didn't help. Smoke from gunfire blurred visibility. Torches flickered. Horses panicked. Units moved independently, convinced they were responding correctly to a threat no one had clearly identified. Some soldiers fled, assuming a full enemy assault was underway. Others chased them, assuming retreat was a sign of treason or collapse. At one point, entire sections of the army were fighting other sections, both fully convinced they were defending themselves against an attack. This wasn't strategy. This was reflex, fear, and assumption colliding at full speed. The most surreal part? The actual enemy, the one everyone had been waiting for, was nowhere near the center of this chaos. If they were watching from a distance, they were probably just as confused as everyone else, wondering how an opposing army managed to self-destruct without any assistance. By the time the noise began to fade, the camp was unrecognizable. Formations were broken. Supplies were scattered. Soldiers were missing, injured, or simply gone, having run in whatever direction felt safest at the time. And slowly, as the adrenaline drained away and the sun began to creep toward the horizon, the horrible realization set in. This wasn't an ambush. This wasn't an enemy tactic. This wasn't even bad luck. This was an army that had accidentally fought itself and lost. And the consequences of that realization were only just beginning. Morning light has a cruel way of exposing bad decisions. And as the sun rose over the camp, it revealed something no commander ever wants to see. An army that looked like it had survived a major engagement without actually fighting one. Units were scattered in the wrong places. Tents were abandoned. Supplies had been trampled, lost, or left behind in a hurry. Some soldiers returned slowly, confused and embarrassed, trying to figure out who they had been shooting at or running from just hours earlier. The officers had an even worse job ahead of them. They had to reconstruct the night, to ask questions whose answers made no sense. Who fired first? Who gave the order? Why did this unit retreat? Why did that unit advance? And most importantly, why did so many reports contradict each other completely? The answer, of course, was painfully simple and deeply uncomfortable. There was no single story because there was no shared understanding. Everyone experienced a different version of the same chaos, filtered through exhaustion, fear, and a language barrier thick enough to derail an empire. Some units believed they had been attacked by the enemy and responded heroically. Others believed they were suppressing a mutiny. A few thought they were following legitimate orders. Many just ran, because running felt safer than trying to decode shouted phrases in the dark. The damage wasn't just physical. Morale took a brutal hit. Trust between units eroded overnight. Soldiers became wary not only of the enemy, but of their own allies. And that's a dangerous mindset in any military operation. When the real enemy finally did appear, they encountered an army that was already exhausted, disorganized, and psychologically rattled. An army that had spent the night fighting ghosts and each other. The result was predictable. The force that once looked impressive on paper now struggled to function as a coherent whole. Retreats turned chaotic. Defensive positions collapsed faster than expected. And what could have been a manageable campaign turned into a textbook example of how not to run a multinational army. Historically, the incident became something commanders quietly avoided talking about. Not because it wasn't important, but because it was embarrassing. It's much easier to blame weather, logistics, or enemy brilliance than to admit your army unraveled because nobody could communicate clearly under pressure. But the impact lingered. Military planners took notes. Empires learned, slowly and painfully, that coordination isn't just about uniforms and loyalty. It's about shared language, shared signals, and shared understanding, especially when things go wrong. Because when confusion reaches a critical mass, it doesn't just slow you down. It defeats you. And that brings us to the part where history, as always, offers a final, ironic lesson. History loves grand narratives, brilliant generals, decisive battles, turning points that reshape the world. But every now and then, it quietly leaves us a story like this one, almost as if to say, before you take yourselves too seriously, remember this. An entire battle triggered not by strategy or ideology, but by a misunderstanding that snowballed out of control. No brilliant deception, no heroic last stand. Just a multilingual army discovering, in the worst possible way, that nodding along doesn't count as communication. It's tempting to laugh, and honestly, a little laughter is earned here, but the real takeaway is surprisingly human. When systems grow too large and too complex, they rely heavily on assumptions. Assumptions that everyone understands the plan. Assumptions that authority translates cleanly across cultures. Assumptions that panic will somehow respect chain of command. It doesn't. This incident didn't happen because the soldiers were incompetent. It happened because they were human. Tired humans, stressed humans, humans trying to interpret unfamiliar words in the dark while holding weapons and expecting danger at every turn. And that's what makes this story linger. Because it's easy to look back and say, how could this possibly happen? But anyone who's ever been part of a chaotic group project, a badly run meeting, or a family WhatsApp argument knows the answer. Scale that confusion up. Add uniforms. Add weapons. Remove sleep. Congratulations. You've reinvented one of history's most unnecessary battles. The irony is almost poetic. An army assembled from across an empire, meant to showcase unity and power, undone by the simple fact that unity requires understanding, and power collapses fast when no one knows what anyone else is saying. So the next time someone says, "Don't worry, we'll figure it out as we go," just remember this story. Somewhere in history, thousands of people tried exactly that. And history responded with a very loud, very confusing oops. Here's the final twist that makes this story even more painfully ironic. The battle became so infamous among historians that, for a long time, people assumed it must have been exaggerated. Surely an entire army couldn't collapse just because of miscommunication, right? Surely someone, somewhere, would have stepped in and clarified things. But the more accounts historians examined, the clearer the pattern became. Different languages, conflicting testimonies, no single, clean narrative, which, in a strange way, only reinforced the point. The confusion wasn't a bug in the story. It was the story. What's even more telling is what happened afterward. Militaries across Europe slowly began standardizing command languages, signals, and training methods. Not overnight, not enthusiastically, but this incident sat quietly in the background as a reminder of what happens when you assume communication will take care of itself. It also explains why modern armies obsess over drills, call signs, standardized phrases, and redundancy. Not because they love bureaucracy, but because somewhere in the past, an army learned the hard way that "I thought you said" can be historically catastrophic. And in the end, that's what makes this episode perfect for History Oops. No villain. No mastermind, just a series of very human decisions, layered on top of each other, until the whole structure collapsed under its own assumptions. A battle that didn't need to happen. A disaster no one planned. A moment where history shrugged and said, well, that could have been avoided. If you enjoyed this journey through one of history's most preventable disasters, you know what to do. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let us know in the comments which historical mess-up still makes you shake your head in disbelief. Because history isn't just about victories and legends. Sometimes, it's about the moments where everything went wrong, simply because nobody spoke the same language. And those are the stories worth telling.